Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in GIFT TV. Please, if you have not subscribed to GIFT TV, please kindly subscribe for more updates on research methods, program evaluation, design, and global politics. Thank you. Today's lesson, we'll be looking at research gap, how to identify research gap. This particular topic is very critical and is also very essential because many students, researchers are struggling to identify a research gap. One was, what is a research gap? A research gap is a question or a problem that has not been answered by any of the existing studies, or maybe a research within your field. In summary, a research gap is essentially an unanswered question or unresolved problem in the field of study, reflecting the lack of existing world literature. So that is what a research gap is about. Sometimes a research gap exists when there is a concept or a new idea that hasn't been studied at all. Sometimes you find a research gap if all the existing research is outdated and in need of a new or updated research, or perhaps a specific population has not been well studied. Take, for example, if you have gathered enough evidence about maybe a video game, and based on the evidence, there are plenty of studies on a particular group, like let's say teenagers and video games, but you realize that there is not much has been done, but not enough study on toddlers and videos have been done, then you have identified a gap. Okay, so you're going to focus on video games and toddlers because a lot of study has been already conducted on video games and teenagers. Remember that any research gap you find in any field of study in your area, being in economics, being in business, being in policy, being in public administration, where more study and more research need to be conducted. You need to remember that any research gap you find in any area, it doesn't matter the field of study. It requires that more studies and more research needs to be conducted because a gap is a need. It serves as a justification for the study. Without a research gap, there is no study. It is a research gap that helps justify your statement of the problem. It is through the gap that informs the title, the topic of the study. It informs the purpose. It informs the problem state and even the research question. Because it's the gap that gives the research idea. So you need to take note of that. All right, let's also look at some of the words or phrases that we use to describe a gap. Okay. Researchers use words or phrases like has not yet been clarified, or sometimes in the text you see that little is known about this particular concept. And the other phrases that might also help you identify a gap outside has not yet been clarified or has not yet been studied. So some of the other phrases that researchers has also been used to state or identify a research gap is has or have not been studied or reported or explained or elucidated, or maybe there's still more to be done in that area, or there's a need for this particular discussion. There is a gap. Sometimes too, you see that in a test, there will be this phrase. The key question remains that, or the key question is, it gives an indication that there's a need for more in that field, or maybe there's lack of clarity, or there's an imbalance in terms of the knowledge about what caused what and what leads to what. It's very important to look at that. It's important to also address also another phrase that captures a gap. So all these phrases captures a research gap. So when you see in a test, then it should give you an indication, an idea about what a gap is about. There are several types of research gap. There are several types. While there are many different types of research gap, in this particular video, I will explain only 4 most common ones that students and researchers encounter. And they include the classical literature gap, that is the traditional gap, the disagreement gap, the contextual gap, and that of the methodological gap. So I will take them one after the other. Let's look at the first one. The first gap is the classical literature gap. This type of research gap emerges when there is a new concept or phenomenon that hasn't been studied much or at all. Okay, if there is a new phenomenon, there is a new situation, there is a new issue that has not been studied at all. Talk of COVID. Okay, COVID is a new concept that just came in. So there is a lot to be written about COVID-19. Another example is the social media platform. When the social media platform is launched, there is an opportunity to exploit its impact on users. How you could even leverage for marketing, its impact on society, and many others. The same applies for new policies, new technologies, new modes of communication, just to mention a few. All these give an idea that there is a call for study to assess its impact, its effectiveness. So there is a need to also look at that. These are the classical literature gap, the traditional gap, because once there is a new concept, definitely not much has been done over there. Talk of new topics or new discipline. All right, it means there's a lot to explore in such field. Let's look at the second element. The second type is the disagreement gap. As the name suggests, disagreement. A disagreement gap emerges when there are contrasting or contradictory findings in existing research regarding a research question. So once there's an imbalance in the research findings, there's a need to clarify. When it happens like that, there's a gap. There's a gap because maybe about 60% of the literature, about 55% or 50% of the literature are saying that this particular enzyme causes this issue. And this particular enzyme also causes the same issue. Therefore, who is saying the truth? There's a balance. Once it happens like that, we need additional literature or research to come address the issue. If you observe that in many disciplines, we have what is called several schools of thought. Those schools of thought have conflicting themes like disagreement gaps. All right, you see, even in economics, you see the monetarists, you see the classicals, you see the Keynesians. They all have different viewpoints about how the economy should behave. You see that. So always there is a gap that researchers cannot help fill it in the literature. Let's take a typical example. Example of such gap from Osaka, Itaho, and Kurada, 1995. It reads, the relationship between the 4 damping factors, that is internal friction, support loss, airflow force in free space, and squeeze force has not yet been clarified because there is no clarity whether this leads to that or this leads to that. So it is not obvious which one is dominant in actual microsystems. So there's a need for more study to clarify the imbalance. Importantly, for this particular type of research gap, there is a need to be a relatively balanced set of opposing findings. So you cannot have maybe about 90% of the articles saying A and 10% saying B, and you said there is a disagreement. No. They should have a set of balance. Maybe 50%, 50%, or maybe 55, close to maybe 50 or 45. At least it has some sort of balance. So there's a need, if whether your study will go for the 45% or for 55, or the 50% half, or go to the other half. So these are some of the things that we can rely on to address issues about disagreement when there is a call for more study. Another type is the contextual gap. The third type of the research gap is the contextual gap. Simply put, a contextual gap exists when there is already a decent body of existing research on a particular topic, but an absence of research in a specific context. All right, for example, there could be a lack of research on maybe a specific population, as we saw earlier, from the video games and the teenagers, where there was not enough study on the toddlers and the video games. It is about a specific population, perhaps maybe on a certain age group, maybe gender, ethnicity, race. All these things can form part and also bring out a research gap. And this particular gap is based on the context. Okay? So the context could be on the population, it could be on the geographic area, or maybe the time period. So with respect to the geographical area, for example, a city, maybe a country or region, maybe there is more study in the advanced country, but less on the developing countries, or maybe in the sub-Saharan countries. All right? Maybe if you talk about, what do you call it, FDI, or maybe if you are talking about institutions, maybe there is more study on the institution and economic group when it comes to the advanced country, but less on the sub-Saharan continent or the sub-Saharan countries, or maybe the Africa continent. Another example too can be on certain time period, but the bulk of the study maybe took place many years ago, and even decades ago, long time. And what is very constant is change, because probably maybe the landscape has already changed. So what thing that has happened maybe 50 years ago may not be relevant maybe today. So the time frame too can also impact and brings about a gap. That is why if you see that sometimes if you are doing literature review, your supervisor may tell you that your references are too old. It is telling you that maybe if there is not much information on the current information, make sure you address your issue on that gap so they may understand your study. The contextual gap is a popular option for dissertations and theses, especially for first-time researchers, as it allows you to develop your research on a solid foundation for existing literature and potentially even use existing survey measures, because most students rely on the contextual gap, okay? Because it helps you to situate your study in the existing literature. Maybe there is more study on this particular population, but less on that. Maybe more on the advanced, but less on that. The literature is already there. So it helps you to build your literature and also situate your study into the body of knowledge. The last but not the least is the methodological gap. Okay. The methodological gap. With the methodological gap approach, you will need to argue that the research design of existing study is lacking in some way. This is about the method, it's about the design. Maybe the approach to addressing that particular issue has always been in a quantitative study. Less is known in qualitative way. There is a gap. For example, you might argue that the bulk of the existing research has taken a quantitative approach, and therefore there is a lack of rich insight and texture that a qualitative study could provide. All right. Similarly, you might also argue that existing studies have primarily taken a cross-sectional approach, and as a result, have only provided a snapshot view of the situation, whereas maybe there's a need for longitudinal approach that could help uncover how the construct of the variable have been evolved over the years, over time. You justify why You should care about your study. You should justify the need for that particular study. And that is the work of the literature gap, or maybe the research gap, or maybe the research problem. Okay, the research problem is the same as the literature gap, the same as the research gap. And this element is the one that informs the statement of the problem. It informs the title of the study. It informs the purpose of the study. And it also informs the justification of the study, the significance of it. That's the rationale. All right, how to find a research gap? Now that we have a clear picture on the various types of the gaps, and then also knowing much about what the research gap is about. How do you find these research gaps? To begin with, it's all about reading. You need to read a lot. Okay, you need to go into the literature, review more literature, do systematic reviews, meta-analysis, gather enough literature about the concept that you want to write about the idea that you want to develop. Okay, that will help you to know what has been done or what needs to be done. The what has been done will help you to know the available literature, and what needs to be done will be the unanswered questions that you are looking solution for. Okay, so it's very important to read extensively. The next is you should dig into the most recent journal articles to wrap up your head around the current state of the knowledge that you want to embark on. All right, make sure you're familiar yourself with the recent journal articles. Okay, the new publication, the current publication, so that at least you know what has been done. Okay, very important. Also, it's a good idea to look at recent dissertation and thesis. You can look for already published dissertations or theses from ProQuest, EBSCO, or open access journals, okay, as a way to lay hands on as many dissertations and theses that falls under the concept that you want to explain. Once you're able to gather enough dissertation or thesis, okay, you have to go to the section that is titled Further Research Opportunities, depend on your institution, okay, depend on your university or the institution. In the last part or in the last chapter of every dissertation or thesis, you have a section titled Further Research Opportunities, or Further Research is Needed, or Suggestions for Future Research. Suggestion for future research. All right. So it depends on where you find yourself. In this session, the researcher will explicitly state where more studies are required. In other words, where potential research gap may exist in the suggestion for future research. That is what many existing study tends to address there. They always state future research there. They always state what other researchers should look at if they want to use their study as a model, as a springboard. So always go to that session in the conclusion chapter. There will be a session called Suggestion for Future Research, or Future Research Opportunities, or Further Research is Needed, depending on the institution. Okay? Or sometimes you can also go to the session where it is titled Limitations. But the limitations always exposes the ideas for methodology-based research gaps. And you know that one of the gaps is about the design, the method. So if it has some limitations, there's a gap there that one can also tap in to come out to the research gap. The research gap can take different dimensions, different forms, but the most common ones are those that I have just explained. Okay? So make sure that you always identify the type of gap that you are utilizing so that it will help you to know the direction, the focus of the study. Let's also look at areas readers would like to read about a research gap. For instance, if you are doing a dissertation or let's say a thesis, okay, where are you supposed to put or have some element of a research gap there so that readers can know what the gap is in that study? At the last paragraph of the genesis of the problem, or maybe the overview of the problem in the introduction section of every chapter, the introduction chapter, the last paragraph before you come to the statement of the problem section, the last paragraph, readers must know what the gap is, because after you have discussed all the different dimensions of the problem in the overview or in the genesis of the problem, from the past situation, the current situation, you have to settle on the gap so that the problem will come and will stay. Because you discuss all the different dimensions of the problem, the situation in the genesis or in the overview session, then you state the problem. So the gap must come so that it will allow the problems, the statement of the problem to come and settle. So at the last paragraph of the genesis of the problem in the introduction session, or depending on the institution, sometimes they title the overview of the problem, or sometimes even some institutions title the background of the study. All right, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it is the introduction session before the statement of the problem. The last paragraph, we need to see the gap discussion there, okay? And also in the literature review session, the last session of the literature review chapter of your dissertation or thesis, which is sometimes captioned as chapter summary and the literature gap. The last element in the literature chapter 2, you must see the gap there. That is where the gap is discussed extensively, because it's the summary of the literature. What has been done, the contradictions, the similarities, the method, the different methods, and what needs to be done. So you see that the chapter summary and the gap session there will be more detailed than what you state in the introduction session. Because introduction session is that you are given a hint about the gap that is going to help the problem statement to come and settle. But in the literature review session, that is where you discuss the different dimensions of the gap under the chapter summary and the literature gap. All right, in summary, let's look at some of the key concepts or takeaways that one should take note. One, a researcher gap is an unanswered question or unresolved problem in a field, which reflects a lack of persistent research in that space. Two, to find potential research gap, start by reviewing recent journal articles in your area of interest. And you also observe that the four most common types of the research gaps include the traditional literature gap, that's the classical or the classic, the disagreement gap, the contextual gap, and that of the methodological gap. Thank you very much for subscribing to Gibbs TV. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.